And I want to welcome you to the Engaged Employee Podcast. Our mission is to emphasize the relationship between the employee and the workplace with the goal of enhancing engagement levels to create a more productive and satisfying work environment. While many organizations may strive to create a more engaging atmosphere, they often miss the mark by connecting for connection with big team building events like axe throwing or escape rooms. Those activities only leave employees with a short lived sense of belonging. Or they may try smaller and more suffocating events like happy hours or group birthday celebrations that their employees feel obligated to attend. As a social connections and business culture coach, I found that a stable, engaged, productive workforce needs to have a shift in focus from mandatory fun and manufactured connection towards towards building trust and authentic conversation. Join me and Dr. Ritch Hall as we dive into social wellness strategies for the individual employee, techniques for developing interpersonal relationships with coworkers, and even some more approaches to for leaders to enrich the overall organizational culture. My guest today is Dr. Ritch Hall II. Dr. Ritch is a licensed psychologist and owner of PsychWorks Clinic, a mental health and private practice with offices in Cincinnati and Oxford, Ohio. Dr. Ritch previously worked for 8 years as a coordinator of substance abuse services for the Miami Student Counseling Service. A graduate of the University of Cincinnati, his clinical approach and dialectical behavior therapy and motivational interviewing through his clinical approach is dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, and motivational interviewing through a series of theory lens. Dr. Hall is the current president of the Cincinnati Association of Black Psychologists and has appeared several times on Cincinnati's Local 12 Good Morning Cincinnati program for his Ask Dr. Hall segment. Dr. Hall also has a podcast about psychology called Psychologize You, where he and his guests work to educate, inform, and reduce stigma around mental health topics. Our conversation today will be focused on self-care strategies for the employees. Please welcome Dr. Hall.
Hey, how's it going?
Applause. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Hall. I appreciate that you spent time out of your busy day to come talk to us. So we're really focused on we have a short amount of time, and I'm going to ask you questions, and we all want answers from the experts. So our conversation is going to be focused on individual self-care strategies for employees. I'd be
Mhm.
curious to know, what experiences have you had to make this so important to you?
So having worked in a college counseling center, and also worked corporate prior to going to graduate school. I worked for a large bank out here. I've had a lot of experiences where it could be pretty high energy, pretty high demand, and so recognize that taking care of myself was an important part of managing these environments to be successful because the work doesn't get done if the machine that's supposed to be doing the work breaks down and I am the machine.
Hmm.
So I got to care for the machine that is me if I want to be my most efficient and pursue some of my pretty lofty ambitions.
Absolutely. So then, did you have a particular experience that had happened to realize that, oh, it's starting to break down? And
I got sick. I did something that a lot of people who are pretty, um, you know, uh, high energy, high ambition. You're working really, really hard, and then suddenly your body kind of craps out on you.
mm,
And I remember joking about it the week before, like, "Hey, I made a cast iron. I never get sick," and then was down for like 2 weeks, and had had to take a full break and recognize, oh, my body probably needs to do this more often, and I need to be taking better care of myself so that I don't get into this space. I mean, and it was just bronchitis that just lasted what felt like forever.
ooh,
Uh, but uh, between
then
that and when COVID came along, I got COVID. I got first round COVID, and that made me again reevaluate. Like, hey, make sure that you're doing things like exercise and eating well,
mm,
because if you take these things for granted, they won't always be available to you. So usually it was a matter of my body saying I needed to sit down and rest for a while, and then me realizing in that space, oh, you can incorporate some of these things that you do when you're not working so hard, to help yourself be more efficient when you do need to work.
Oh yeah, oil the machine that has to run, right? You got to take care of the
Mhm.
parts and everything that goes into who we are and what we do as humans. And
Yes.
so I'd be curious to know because you had mentioned being sick and made of cast iron, and I imagine that just because you get sick, that mentality doesn't go away. You probably just want to still get up and do
Yeah.
something like, oh man, I feel so lazy. But you have COVID and walking bronch. Sit down, please,
Right.
relax,
Right.
take
And
care of yourself.
that was sort of what did it for me was my I wanted to still go, and that's usually my indication. I've learned over the years that when I start feeling like I don't feel like I can get up and do things, that's usually when I know, like, oh wait, you're either going to get sick or your body and your mind is telling you slow down. And there's a part of me that the mental part of me is like, no, let's go, but the physical part of me is like, I don't have it. And so having to like recognize that voice is a valid concern to be addressed early rather than too late, because when
Mm.
it was too late, I was pretty much down for the count by the time I really did sit down. So
Yeah.
uh
So then that brings me to a couple of questions for you addressing the beforehand. So, usually we don't change the oil until the oil light comes on or something like that. If we're in that habit of doing so, we're going to run the car until the tires fall off. But
mhm,
we want to address the fact that, okay, we reach this point in which we have just collapsed and we're exhausted. What can we
mhm,
do? It's a two-part question. What can we do at that point in time to help ourselves feel a little better and prevent? And then the second part of this is to not go back into that pattern of where we're
mhm.
not taking care of ourselves.
Yeah. And so, I think one of the things that I often tell my clients is some of the ways you take care of yourself when you're feeling down, feeling low, feeling burnt out are similar to what you do when you're not feeling well, when you're sick, right? It's taking a day, trying to eat some good, healthy foods, trying to, wrap yourself up in a nice warm blanket or something that makes you feel comfortable and secure, and just, release yourself from the stress of your responsibilities. So, telling yourself, maybe repeatedly, if you're a person like me, okay, I know that popped into your head, but today is not the day we deal with that, or right now is not the day we deal with that, right? So, how can you set aside time when you're feeling that burnout, that tiredness, that worn down, to really take care of yourself physically? Like I said, in many of the ways that you would if you were saying, you had a head cold or a 24-hour flu and you needed to just chill for a day. It's, maybe it could be watch some things you like on television. It could be sit back and read a book that you like. Like, what's the thing you can do for you that will help you to recharge and replenish as opposed to costing you more energy?
Yeah, that I think that's really, really important as a person who was in this cycle too, and doing all these things that I could just to focus on work. Actually, it would bring work home, and there was no work-life balance. And this was way before COVID happened, when it was just I found myself working at home or
Mhm.
living at work. I think that's the new term for it. Living at work. I
Yeah.
found myself doing that. And so I think it's really important to think that there is something else that I'd rather be doing rather than working. There's something that
Mhm.
else that's really important to me. And so for those people out there who don't quite know how to get to that point, how would you recommend them starting on this journey to discover more about, what it is that they can do outside of work?
I think one of the things in your example is a clear indicator. It's where do you set the boundaries, right? In order to really truly care for yourself, there have to be boundaries between the work identity you and the home identity you, and recognizing where can I put those limits. Okay, if the day ends at 5, then maybe I stop working at 5, right? And that when I go home, I take the time to explore what are the things that I, the person, like to do, as opposed to being employee Lee. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
6, 7, 8 o'clock, you're still the employee, and I'm
Yeah.
I'm still guilty of that, right?
Hmm.
My kids are like, why do you only come home at dark? Because I'm running my own business now. But it's a thing where I have to like learn where to draw the lines and say, hey, this is where I get to be just me, and this is where I'm the employee. Or when am I finding ways to clock out when the time comes? And when I do clock out, how can I then explore what just the person me likes to do, so that
Hmm.
I'm not always on, and can sort of get some joy and fulfillment out of my free time, so that it's
That's
not all business.
Yeah, and that I think that I started to laugh a little bit because we had met on TikTok, and there was this big TikToker out there who is, she's like always, okay, thanks, bye. As soon as like 5 o'clock happens, I forget what her name is, but I'm
Mhm.
like, I admire her so much because if 4:59 came and as soon as closed the laptop and I was like, How do you do that? But there's so much joy in that. She's like, "Okay, thanks, bye. I'm out of here. I'm acting my wage, I'm doing all those things." And I know that's a little different than what we're talking about here, but the idea about being able to separate yourself from work and then doing the thing that's joyful to you and creating that boundary, even though, work may feel like it's everything, it's really not. And I
Right.
really like that message that you have.
Right, right, right. And you can still have success, you can still have ambition, but you also have to recognize, as I said before, you can't always be on the grind, right? You got to have the time where you are just you. And that sometimes the stepping away from work, like we know from studies, we know from research that sometimes some of the problems you're so frustrated with and trying to solve at work, you can only get clarity on those once you've taken the time off, once you've, taken a walk, or once you, closed the laptop for a while, gotten yourself some food, replenished your physical body, then you'll come at it more clearly the next day or later. But if you're always in it, it is so much harder to solve all the problems to be the best version of yourself.
Wonderfully said. I completely agree with you. That makes perfect sense to me. I mean, you have to step away to see the bigger picture, and you can't see the trees from the forest if you're just always in it. And so
Hmm.
I noticed you have a podcast. We talked about that at the very beginning of a podcast, and you talk about some of these things on the podcast.
Yes. So, yeah, we talk a lot about so far. The first season of the podcast was largely about like why people would want to go to therapy, how to sort of reduce some of the stigma around therapy, and how to sort of recognize when you might need more help than you currently have. So, we hadn't gotten into like treatment models or anything like that. It was a lot more about when do you realize help is needed? Because I just felt like there were so many people who I would talk to who know they probably need a little bit more support, but are often reluctant to get it, reluctant to seek it, or just don't trust it.
Absolutely. If I would chime in on that, like I would not need anybody to tell me how to live my life. I've got it. It's perfectly fine.
Right.
And you know, I think I can get it, pull myself up by my bootstraps because there are so
Mhm.
many messages out there that tell us to just deal with it, especially
Right.
as a Black American.
Hmm.
God's got it. We don't need anything else but prayer and things like
Hmm.
that. You can't open up. And as a man too, it makes it
Yeah.
a little more difficult or a lot more difficult because you can't show your feelings at all. You're expected to be stoic. And so I
Yep.
want to say, like, it's really important message that you have out there to take that stigma and shame out of looking for help, just
Yep.
looking for some support. We can't all do it. We can't do it alone. We really
Yeah.
can't. And
Yeah.
so I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It was Our conversation was really short and brief because it's supposed to. Now you got to get back to work. We
Right.
laugh because we're both going to do work because we're both entrepreneurs in that way, but we know our limits and
Hmm.
we have this time for ourselves. So I wonder if you can tell us what else is going on with you. Can you share where else the audience can find you? What big things are happening in your life?
Sure. 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 So you can find me on my website, um, psychworksllc.com. I think you had that on the screen earlier.
Mhm.
And it'll be,
It's
I guess,
back.
in the show notes. Or on TikTok at PsychWorks Clinic, where I put up TikTok videos randomly, whatever comes to mind that entertains me. And then you also mentioned my podcast, Psychologize You. That's Psychologize with a U at the end, where I'm going to be releasing some new episodes this year where we talk a lot more about mental health stigma, and treatment models, and just some. I'm going to try to get into some pop culture stuff just because people are interested in that, and I don't mind talking about it. I just usually I try not to be so educational and academic in my approach. And so that's a lot of what I'm doing is more content like that while running a private practice and trying to raise decently healthy kids.
Oh yeah. Decently healthy kids. I love
Yeah.
it. I'm not a parent, so I'm really I'm really in awe about how you all go out and raising these little versions of yourself and instilling your ideas and keeping them safe and all that stuff that you do. So big round of applause for that and you for coming on the show. First episode down. I really appreciate you being
Yeah.
here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate you asking me on.
All right. Let me All right. Thanks, Dr. Hall, for sharing your story with us. I'm going to make sure all of the information is in the show notes for us. And if you have any questions for him, please feel free to email him. I do have some questions. I do have some his email stuff here. I'll put all his links and stuff in there so you can reach out to him and actually have a conversation if you need to. But I highly recommend that you follow him on TikTok. That's where we met. And he's really, really fun and entertaining.